They say the darkest places aren't those without light. They're the corners of your mind where shadows form, growing longer and deeper the more you ignore them. What if one day those shadows took shape? Would you even notice before it was too late? Emma had always been a rational person. Growing up in a small town meant ghost stories were part of the local culture, but she'd never believed in any of them. The old Morris house, a rotting structure that stood isolated at the edge of town, was one of the most popular tales. People whispered about strange things happening there, but Emma brushed it off as nonsense. One late autumn afternoon, after a tiring week in the city, she decided to take a walk through the woods near the old Morris house. It wasn't out of curiosity, but more out of the desire for some peace and quiet. The crunch of leaves underfoot and the crisp, cool air helped ease her thoughts. As she walked deeper into the forest, she realized she had never ventured this far before. The trees grew denser, and a strange, creeping fog began to roll in. A sense of unease settled over her. It wasn't that she was lost. She could still see the familiar ridge where the town lay beyond, but something felt off. The old Morris house came into view, silhouetted against the fading light. It stood alone, surrounded by a sea of dead trees. A cold wind brushed her neck, causing her to shudder. She knew she should turn back, but something held her in place. The door to the house swung open, seemingly on its own, and Emma felt an invisible force tugging her toward it. Emma woke the next morning with no memory of how she ended up inside the Morris house. The interior was just as decrepit as she had imagined. Faded wallpaper peeling from the walls, dust-covered furniture, and a suffocating sense of decay. A layer of grime coated every surface, and the air smelled of rot. Yet something about the place felt inhabited. As she stood, she noticed deep, dark shadows creeping along the corners of the room. The daylight struggled to penetrate the space, despite the open windows. It was as though the shadows had a life of their own, bending and twisting unnaturally. She felt watched. Stepping carefully through the house, Emma explored its narrow halls and creaking floors. Rooms were filled with relics of a bygone era, dusty mirrors, antique furniture, and tattered curtains. Then she saw it. A figure, barely perceptible, standing at the far end of the hallway. Its outline was dark, a mere silhouette in the dim light. "Hello?" Emma's voice trembled as it echoed through the hall. No response. The figure didn't move. Her heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out across her skin. She blinked, and the figure was gone. Curiosity took over. Emma decided to ask around town about the Morris house. She visited the local library and found old records about the place. What she uncovered was disturbing. The Morris family had vanished in 1922 under mysterious circumstances. The house had been passed from owner to owner, none staying for long. People reported seeing shadows moving in the house, figures that shouldn't exist, and hearing whispers that were impossible to locate. The more Emma read, the more the stories aligned with her own experience. The shadows, the figure. It was all too real. That night, she couldn't sleep. The house weighed on her mind, and strange dreams plagued her, dreams of a tall, slender figure watching her from the darkness. It never approached, never spoke, but its presence filled her with dread. Despite her growing fear, something drew her back to the Morris house. She couldn't explain it. Was it the thrill of uncovering a mystery, or something more sinister pulling her in? As she stepped inside the house again, the shadows seemed denser, heavier. They clung to the walls and floors like thick, black ink. She tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the scattered objects left by previous owners. But every room felt colder, and the air seemed to grow stiller, thicker, with every breath. Then she heard it, a faint whisper like the rustling of dry leaves. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the voice grew louder, clearer. Emma? Her name echoed from the shadows. She froze. How could it know her name? Was someone there? She turned sharply, expecting to see the figure from her nightmares, but the room was empty. The shadows, however, had grown thicker, pooling around her feet. They rippled and swirled, as if alive. Panicking, she rushed to leave the house, but as she reached for the door, it slammed shut. The shadows surged forward, coiling around her legs, dragging her deeper into the house. Emma awoke in a small candlelit room, bound to an old chair. Her arms and legs ached, but it was her surroundings that filled her with terror. The walls were covered in symbols, dark, twisted runes that pulsed with a sickly, unnatural glow. In the corner of the room, the shadowy figure stood again, barely discernible against the darkness. It spoke in a voice that was not entirely human, a low, guttural whisper. "You should not have come." Emma tried to scream, but no sound escaped her throat. The figure moved closer, its form becoming clearer with each step. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a man, or at least what used to be one. His face was pale, his eyes black as coal, and his body seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as if he were made of the very shadows that filled the room. "You are marked," he said. "The house has chosen you." Emma's mind raced. What did that mean? Marked for what? She struggled against her bindings, but they only tightened. The figure's cold hand brushed against her cheek, sending a wave of nausea through her. "There is no escape," it whispered, and then, without warning, it was gone. The shadows receded, leaving Emma alone in the room. The bindings around her wrists and ankles loosened, and she collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. Emma left the house that night, but something had followed her. At first, it was subtle. The shadows in her apartment seemed darker, more oppressive. She heard faint whispers in the quiet of the night, voices that sounded like the wind but carried her name. She stopped sleeping. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it, the shadow man standing at the foot of her bed, watching her with those empty, black eyes. She started to lose track of time, unable to separate her nightmares from reality. Her friends noticed the change, but she couldn't explain what was happening. How could she? The whispers grew louder. Shadows moved on their own, creeping toward her, swallowing the light. She couldn't escape them. Not in her home, not at work, not even in broad daylight. The world around her darkened, and Emma felt herself slipping into madness. Desperate for answers, Emma returned to the Morris house one last time. She knew it was a mistake, but what choice did she have? The shadows had taken over her life, and the only way to end it was to face whatever was inside that house. This time, the house was waiting for her. The door creaked open as she approached, and the shadows seemed to surge forward, welcoming her back. She stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure was there, waiting in the center of the room, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "You cannot fight it," the figure whispered. "You are part of this now." Emma took a deep breath, steeling herself. "What do you want from me?" The figure smiled, a cold, lifeless grin. "Your soul," it said simply. "You will join us, the shadows' hunger." This is just the beginning of a longer story. Stay subscribed for the second part of the story. Turn on notifications so you won't miss it. You can check out other stories like this on this channel.